In this podcast, we're going to discuss the second part of cellular respiration, which is the citric acid cycle, sometimes called the Krebs cycle. Before we do that, though, I just want to do a little reminder of cellular respiration and what we're looking at, just in general. Okay, the whole purpose, remember, of cellular respiration is to take some sugar, so glucose, C6H12O6, and take some oxygen that we breathe into our cells, and to produce energy in the form of ATP, which is the main thing we want to make, and then as side products or waste products, some water and carbon dioxide. Right, this equation says nothing about the amounts of these products that we make, but it does talk about, in general, what goes in and what comes out of the particular reaction. Okay, a little bit more review before we get into the citric acid cycle. We talked about step 1, glycolysis, in the last vodcast. And remember, we didn't really make a whole lot of ATP in that particular reaction. Okay, it does make ATP, but only a small amount. The important thing that it does is it forms these hydrogen ion carriers, which I refer to as kind of like a school bus. Remember, the NAD could pick up hydrogens and turn into NADH to shuttle those hydrogens around where they needed to go. And then also we talked about how glycolysis helps us to start breaking down glucose, so that by the time glycolysis is done, we've got 2 3-carbon molecules that are both called pyruvate. So we go from the 6-carbon glucose to 2 3-carbon pyruvates. In this vodcast, as I said, we're going to focus on the citric acid cycle right here, which again is going to produce a little bit of ATP, but like the glycolysis step, its most important job is going to be to form some hydrogen ion carriers again. So through steps 1 and 2, we haven't made a lot of ATP, but we're getting ready to use some products from those 2 steps to eventually make lots of ATP in step 3, which we'll get to later. Again, just let's place ourselves where this actually happens. A little bit of review once again. The glycolysis is occurring in the cytoplasm. So if we are looking at the mitochondria, the cytoplasm is all this kind of yellow stuff around the mitochondria, right? The kind of the filling of the cell where chemical reactions can take place. The second step we're going to talk about in this vodcast is happening in the mitochondrial matrix. And again, I talked about this already, but I'll just remind you where that is. This blue area in the inner folds of the matrix, or of the mitochondria, is the matrix. So the pyruvate that is made in cytoplasm in step 1 is going to be out here. Let me make these dots a little bigger. Okay, it's going to be out here in the cytoplasm, right, because that's where glycolysis takes place. So that pyruvate starts out there, and then it moves into the mitochondria through the outer membrane, through the inner membrane, and into the matrix, where that pyruvate starts a process that's going to be called the citric acid cycle. Okay, no more review. We're going to talk about what the citric acid cycle actually does. Let's skip ahead a couple slides here. Alright, again, I can't write as small as these little boxes are, so I'm going to try to write over to the side or above them. But on your diagram, you can write all these little names in the boxes themselves to help identify what's happening in the cycle. Remember, I said we're going to start with pyruvate, and each glucose molecule that goes through cellular respiration, starting with glycolysis, gets first broken down into 2 pyruvates. Remember, each pyruvate had 3 carbons. In this step, it's going to be especially important to keep track of where these carbons are. Alright, so the pyruvate is where we're starting at the top of our cycle. Remember, pyruvate is P, Y, should probably make this thinner. Make it a little bit smaller pen. Okay, we're going to drag this down. Let's try again. P-Y-R-U-V-A-T-E. Okay, there's our pyruvate. Now, again, how many carbons does it have? We'll do this in red. 3 carbons in each pyruvate. So for each glucose that starts glycolysis, we're going to go through the citric acid cycle twice, because only one pyruvate at a time can go through the citric acid cycle. And each glucose turns into 2 pyruvates. So we actually have to go through the citric acid cycle once for each of those 2 pyruvates for a total of 2 times. Alright, so we've got pyruvate. We're going to change that pyruvate into something called acetyl-CoA. A-C-E-T-Y-L, capital C, little O, big A. Okay, acetyl-CoA, and again, that's this box right here. Now, there's going to be a lot of weird naming, or weird sounding names for molecules throughout the citric acid cycle. Try not to get so caught up on what they are, as much as how many carbons do they have in them. Alright, so don't worry about what kind of molecule this acetyl-CoA is. What I want you to be more concerned about is the fact that it only has 2 carbons in it. So, where do we lose that carbon? So sometime between the transition between pyruvate and acetyl-CoA, a carbon is lost. Okay? And that carbon that we pull off of pyruvate is released into the air as carbon dioxide. That's this box right here. And so remember back when I went over the equation for the cellular respiration at the very beginning, and I said one of the waste products is CO2, or carbon dioxide. This is one of the places where that CO2 comes from. One of those waste products that we eventually breathe out. Alright, so we now have a 2-carbon molecule called acetyl-CoA that goes into the matrix, joins with a 4-carbon molecule, which we'll talk about a little bit later, to make a 6-carbon molecule. So this box to the left of my 6 carbons is a 6-carbon molecule we call citric acid. That's why we call it the citric acid cycle. Citric acid. Alright. Handwriting is horrible, but you should be able to spell citric acid based on the title on the slide. So, citric acid is a 6-carbon molecule. The next step in the cycle is to make a 5-carbon molecule, which is this box right here. And just like when we went from the 3-carbon pyruvate to the 2-carbon acetyl-CoA, in order to lose a carbon, we make CO2. So this little arrow showing a box right here is again a molecule of carbon dioxide, because we go from 6 to 5 carbons.